I'm here to talk about tolerance, and I'm here to talk about the implications of the difference between domesticated animals and the wild. Human interactions with animals as wild things, as opposed to things that depend on our affection to feed them, protect them, raise them in this world. Twice, two different people on the internet I've spoken to were rat enthusiasts, people who keep rats as pets, people who develop the same type of emotional attachments to individual rats that are more commonly developed between people and dogs or cats or bunnies in Western culture. Now, all of those things really are about equally absurd. There's an argument that rats are a little bit more absurd in some ways, because, humans and dogs could do certain types of labor together, that kind of thing. You can find some justification. Dogs are a little bit closer to horses in terms of the type of exploitation involved. Here in Canada, before Europeans arrived, dogs really were the work animals. For example, for the Cree, they would pull sleds. The main mode of transport was not using horses, it was using dogs. And this has never been true for rats. And rats are feared as a source of disease. And we do have an instinctual reaction to rats for that reason of fear or apprehension. But people overcome it. People become close to rats. Two different people I spoke to on the internet were really these rat enthusiasts, these rat fanciers. And in both cases, they asked me, and understand that they were going to judge me based on my answer. And it's all right. Where I stood on rats, and if I had discovered how wonderful rats were and how they can be loving companions and friends and so on. And in both cases, there's a significant amount of time, it was more than a year between talking to these two people. I said, well, I used to do humanitarian work in Laos in Southeast Asia. And I knew other people in similar situations. And the real problem we faced, the real problem we were struggling with out there, was of trying to store rice without having rats devour it. As these are third world conditions. And, I preferred nonviolent methods. The most important one was actually designing the stilts. You would have the little hut where they kept the rice would be elevated on stilts. And there were ingenious ways to kind of create obstacles on these stilts. Take a metal cone and have some nails sticking out. It's somewhat artistic approach to making the stilts really difficult for the rats to climb up. Said, but out there, let me tell you, I know you think about rats as pets, but I think about rats on the one hand as animals that live in the wild, and on the other hand as, a real threat to human life on the edge of the jungle or in the middle of the jungle, and as something we struggled with. And of course, one of the reasons why even people who are not vegan try to be nonviolent in getting rid of rats is that there's almost no point in killing them. I mean, they're so numerous, unless you live on a small island where the rat population, you're never going to win by killing rats. So you want to design buildings in a way that just prevents rats from coming inside, prevents rats from eating the food you've stored. But still, my view was fundamentally one of human hostility to rats, and rats do carry disease. Often the fleas living on rats and so on. And rats will bite you in your sleep and come into your bed. And, human relationship with rats in anything remotely resembling the wild is pretty nasty. And now both of these people, let's say more than a year apart between when I spoke to them on the internet, they reacted to this with complete hostility, complete contempt and derision, and real incomprehension. Because their worldview, their understanding of veganism was completely based on the pet-keeping paradigm of keeping dogs as pets, cats as pets, of having love for animals in this sense of petting them and cuddling them and feeding them, keeping them as a house pet. And their whole point, their whole methodology was to extend this paradigm to include rats. And any kind of contrasting view of what it's like living with rats in a third world country and the real practical problems you get into. And sometimes it involves violence against rats. They didn't want to hear it. they wanted to live in a fantasy land where they were morally right and I was morally wrong. And hey, I can sympathize. It is really easy for me to imagine the world from their perspective, in which basically they're good and I'm evil. Now, a lot of people love dogs. It's much more common for people to love dogs than to love rats. I've been attacked by packs of feral dogs. Packs of dogs have attacked me. Not at a human command. Dogs that were roaming around. I could tell some pretty funny stories about having to defend myself against dogs attacking me. I've never had to hurt or kill a dog. I've never had to. But in those experiences, again, in third world countries in Southeast Asia, it's easy to imagine that it could have come to that, because it really was self-defense with a marauding pack of dogs attacking me. And I'm not mad at those dogs. Those dogs were living in what's much closer to a natural situation for them. They weren't my pets. They weren't my friends. I don't love them. They don't love me. And those dogs, again, this is another reason to respect animals and not to kill them and not to exploit them for food and not to torture them in laboratories. You could see the main reason the dogs were attacking me was to prove to one another their social status. As pack animals, the biggest dog wants to show that he's stronger than the next dog. Oh, here comes this human. That I don't think they really expect to be able to eat me, but they think this is my chance to improve my status in the social group of dogs. And, if you're watching them, you can see that. They all look at each other. They're all judging each other's reactions. In one pack, this was on the grounds of a Buddhist monastery in a small town with no electricity and dirt roads in the north of Laos. This is closer to the border between Laos and China than Laos and Myanmar, but up in that area. A pack of dogs attacked me, and there were actually two Buddhist monks sort of sitting on the wall on the edge of the monastery property. It's very common in Theravada Buddhism to have a decorative wall around the edge of the monastery. It's all, I say decorative. The wall is also believed to have supernatural properties. We're not going to do that here. And this big pack of dogs attacked. And the largest dog, he was trying to show how strong and dominant he was. And he actually leapt for my throat. So, I'm tall. I'm 6'3", about 190 centimeters. So this dog made a big jump to try to come at my throat, which again is a natural instinct. If it were attacking a deer or something, that's what their mouth is designed for, is to close on your throat and keep it pinned shut. Now again, I think this dog, the big dog, was just trying to show off in front of the other dogs its boldness. And now I didn't make any contact with the dog actually, but I did have to stand up and I actually raised my foot. I didn't even kick the dog, but I raised my foot so that the dog would have collided with my foot if it kept going in midair. And now, unlike a video game, in real life, when you take a jump, you can't really change direction much once your feet have left the ground. So in this split second, this dog curled up and curled backwards to avoid slamming into my foot. And to say it had been trying to lunge for my throat. And I reacted in this defensive way. And the dog ended up inverting and landing on its own head without coming into contact with me. Yeah. And the two Buddhist monks sitting on the wall laughed and laughed. It was so absurd. It was so Charlie Chaplin-esque. I don't know if you could train a dog to do this intentionally. It was so ridiculous. But then the other thing was all the other dogs in this pack, they also reacted. Like dogs can't laugh. But wow, you could see this whole range of reactions from the dogs. And look, man, out there, as I've said, you get to see turkeys and chickens with more of their natural pack mentality and competing with each other and fighting with each other. And all those things going on. And we're not even really talking about wild animals here. We're talking about feral animals. We're talking about animals that have a little bit of independence from human beings. But look, when I was talking about this stuff with these guys who were rat enthusiasts, all this was unthinkable to them. I've had a couple of videos recently. They have not been as popular as my other videos, talking about this issue of domesticated animals versus the wild, and what the implications are for our moral baseline, for how we conceptualize activism, how we think about veganism, how we're engaged with the problems before us. And these people fundamentally had no tolerance for someone coming from a radically different background. And it really is tolerance we're talking about here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's morally wrong for me to do volunteer humanitarian work that involves feeding starving people in small villages in Laos. Maybe. Maybe that is morally wrong because the lives of rats are more important than the lives of human beings, and my need to keep the rats out of the grain storage, the rice storage, is impossible to morally justify. Maybe. But you know what? If I'm wrong, I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to tolerate it. I need you to tolerate that difference. And if you can, then you can learn something from my experience. You can learn something from my perspective. But step 1 or step 0 is to be tolerant. Say, hey, this guy is also vegan, but he really comes from a different perspective than I do. The person talking to, let's say they were living in California and they only think of a rat as a house pet, like a rabbit or something. Well, man, do you have experience with rabbits in the wild either? Wild rabbits, wild hares. Hare and a rabbit are two different species, but in English, we confuse these terms. A wild hare, they're terrified of human beings. Sorry, I could tell stories about that too, about encountering huge wild hare out in the plains of Saskatchewan. They're enormous creatures. And they don't want to be your pet. They don't want to be your friend. They're defiant and proud and haughty and scared. From their perspective, you are a predator. Any contact you have with a wild hare or wild rabbit, they perceive you as trying to kill them. And, they act accordingly. I remember one of the realest conversations I ever had with another vegan. This guy was vegan with more than a decade of experience as an activist and organizer. I'm not going to say too much about his background. But I remember we were talking about vivisection. And I said we were keeping it 100% real. I said, look, because abolitionism is the current fashion in veganism, I pretend that I'm against absolutely all vivisection under all circumstances. That's what the political movement demands from me. But the reality is, I can think of very rare circumstances in which 1 or 2 vivisections would be necessary or would have to be approved. Like, I see vivisection as being like war. I don't think we should start a war without having not just a vote in parliament. Let's have a referendum. The Soviet Union sent a dog into space, a dog called Laika. It was the first mammal to go into outer space, go into orbit around the Earth. And Laika died. That dog was killed for the progress of science. Now, if only one dog were killed by the progress of science every 10 years, under extraordinary circumstances like that, where it's like, well, we're going to send an animal into space, and we don't actually understand the physics of the Kuiper belt and of radiation in orbit, and, we need to test a bunch of things. Even though I'm a vegan, and I would describe myself as an abolitionist vegan, yes, I can imagine a House of Parliament having a vote and saying, okay, you know what, this one dog in this one space flight, okay, this one dog is going to die. Again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm morally evil. Maybe human exploration of space does not justify the death of even one dog, and maybe saving the lives of people who are starving to death doesn't justify the death of one rat. Maybe that's your moral perspective. But even if I'm wrong, I'm asking you to tolerate me. Okay? As one vegan to another, just as one human being to another, I want you to recognize that I have good intentions, even if I come to this with a somewhat different perspective from what you do. The reason I told the story this way is that this guy, I think he'd probably never said it out loud before, but this guy who was an experienced vegan activist, years and years of experience, doing it full time too, he it was like he came out of the closet. He admitted that actually that was what he believed also. He said, yeah, actually, for years he had been saying absolutely no vivisection is acceptable, but he said actually, really, he believed that an incredibly small amount of vivisection, only for incredibly good reasons, would be acceptable. Now, the reality is, when you look up the statistics, governments around the world pass resolutions and say they're only going to do vivisection when it's medically necessary, and it doesn't work. And it's a failure of democracy, and it's a failure of the parliamentary system. And some countries are better than others. New Zealand right now has better laws than Europe. Europe has better laws than America. America has better laws than Canada. Canada, whatever. We can all torture apes to death with impunity here in Canada. It's ridiculous. But hey, Canada probably has better laws than China. I've never looked at legislation about vivisection in China. It's true, the failure of the legal system in this regard is so terrible, and has been so terrible for decades, that yes, the abolitionist answer is the simple thing to do. And we haven't really gotten to the point where these debates have happened. But they're going to happen. And before we ever get to that stage in activism, so I've said again and again here, if you really want to get organized on vivisection, you need to build common ground with the scientists who are not vegan, who are not 100% abolitionist, but scientists who really understand how the institutions work, where the money comes from, how the protocol gets set up, how the ethics committee works, how government oversight relates to the university or the lab. And people who, those scientists, they probably do not want to see 100% of vivisection get canceled. They probably want to see 90% or 80%. They probably see tremendous waste and suffering for happening for no good reason. Torturing rabbits to death so you can have a slightly redder shade of lipstick. Torturing animals to death for the, we had animals being tortured to death for dentistry at my university in Toronto. It wasn't even, to me, totally unforgivable, unconscionable, immoral, etc. Okay, but the point is that scientist who only wants to see an 80% reduction, not a 100% reduction, or me, I want to see a 99.99% reduction, but I can think of, just like, the desert island thing with you. What if you were on a desert island? Okay, I can think of the equivalent to what if you were on a desert island for vivisection. Even if that guy is wrong, that scientist is wrong, there's a really good reason why I'm asking you not to agree with him, but to have tolerance.